or good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. We are finally into our final portion here for our sessions all together for our suborbital launch coming up with bluShift. I know with some of the announcements recently with the delay, it's easy for us to kind of, be a little dismayed. However, one of the things that I would like to encourage you all with is not only having more time to have a payload that is usable, right, and functionable, but further, right, being able to kind of take a little bit more time to go back now into those different subunits that we've explored, and really get students to kind of engage a little bit further and more importantly, a little bit deeper in each of those things. So today, what we're really going to be talking about is kind of this idea of operations and looking at the flow of how those things kind of come together. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and share a short presentation with you guys. I'm going to try to keep this nice and concise. So thank you for joining us again, as always. We are now in week 10. So if you go ahead and take a look at the suborbital launch for our outline, we are in week 10 now. We've gone through the first 9 weeks looking at this idea of communication in the framework of a scientific task and then an engineering task, and then having a professional within that field kind of follow up. So we were lucky enough to be able to have the representatives over at bluShift be able to join us and kind of talk through and fold together the ideas of our payload sessions a little bit. And hopefully in our operations sessions, we'll be able to do the same. So inside of operations, just to kind of give a little bit of a big picture idea, for those guys who have been with us, you're already aware, but for those of us who maybe haven't followed along as well, we're undergoing this process that has been outlined by Robert Twiggs, who is a absolutely crucial and largely dominant player, and was and probably will be to come in the context of small sat CubeSats or thin sats or pico satellites, however you want to kind of categorize all of those things. So this outline of these 5 kind of core ideas is what is absolutely imperative to include whenever you design a payload from the beginning. In our particular case, because we're not worried about the payload itself from the very beginnings, but we have in the context of bluShift as well as the things that MaxIQ is providing, we don't necessarily have to worry so much about the power and propulsion, but students do have to worry about this idea of the communication protocols that their payload itself will use, what it is that the payload consists of, and then finally, how it is that their payload is going to actually then go through and collect that data itself. So today in our science task, what we're really going to focus on is this idea of why is it that we actually want to send a satellite to space to begin with? And further, how do we go through that process of making some of those decisions? So if we keep going through here, right, the actual role of operations traditionally in C3PO, right, or this framework outlined by Robert Twiggs, is slightly different than the way that we are defining operations in the context of our own payload. So whenever we think of small satellite craft such as CubeSats or pico satellites, right, things like that, really those items are deployed for orbit. And the operations there defines the actual functionality itself, or how it is that the satellite or the CubeSat is going to collect that data and then be able to send that data back to us here on Earth. So when we think about the operations, right, it's the actual process of not just collecting the data, but also simultaneously being able to communicate with that CubeSat in a way that that data can come back and be useful and then be actually employed or deployed in the context of whatever the scientific mission is that it's actually conducting, right? And to be specific, it can be a scientific mission, it can be an engineering design payload, right, where they're testing something, right, and being able to show some kind of some kind of flight heritage with those specific components. In the context of our particular launch with bluShift, the way that we're going to define operations is going to be a little bit different, right? And really what we want to be able to do is think about it in the context of just the payload, right? How is it that our payload is going to be able to collect data right? And not just what kind of data, but what's the process under which that data is going to be collected, right? So thinking about what the output is and how that data is represented, right? So this includes unit analysis potentially, as well as thinking about how it is that two different data types might be able to come together, right? And a metric can be formed of sorts, and then have that metric be able to tell you more information than any one of those data types individually. So one of the other parts of operations, right, as a big picture context, is also thinking about then what kind of restrictions that the payloads that students start with, right, or that in our teams that we have, what those things are that actually will have to be overcome to then be able to successfully collect this data that's in question, or successfully accomplish the task that we set out to begin with. So the big question here that some of you guys might have, right, and many of us should be considering at least, is why is it that we are looking at this idea that really sounds more like the beginning of things more towards the end, right? So in our last kind of bulk session here with weeks 10, 11, 12, in particular, one of the things that we've kind of been able to undergo now in the past 9 weeks is create a familiarity with what it is that we have. So whether that be the STEM starter kit, right, or the extended core that we've in the past 3-4 weeks now been able to kind of play around with, the familiarity of the limitations in which the actual hardware, as well as some of the software limitations have providing or are providing for us, allows us to now synthesize what those limitations actually are. So once we can define those limits, what that means then is that the design process itself can now move forward because we know what we're working within, right? So if that's the case, then this now allows for us to be a little bit more creative in thinking about how we might be able to break out of some of those limitations, or determine what, if any, additional hardware we need or additional software we need that might be able to get us outside of the bounds of those limitations to successfully actually either collect the data that we want, right, or be able to implement a design process that we want to be able to implement here as we go to space on our bluShift launch. And lastly, the beginning at the end, really what it does is it provides a little bit more accountability to be able to own what it is that you and your group are looking to send into space, and the responsibility that comes with knowing that in particular. So if I kind of synthesize this down, really what this last point is stating is students, right, have gone through this process of the last 9 weeks of kind of being able to develop and come to a consensus about what it is that their payload, number one, is going to do, but further, how it is that the sensors that come as a part of the stock payload, what it is that they do and what their limitations and their functionalities are. So if students can now think a little bit further about what it is that they actually want to be able to do, right, that internal portion of their contributions is where that accountability and responsibility really come into play. And specifically in space, right, in particular, as this idea of quote unquote space junk becomes more and more prevalent, one of the things that we'll hear about hopefully in our professional Q&A webinar in our last week here is kind of what the guidelines are and what the actual legal restrictions are in terms of what needs to happen with those satellites as they kind of go into this end of life portion. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of characterize in the context of operations within just the payload itself. So in this week 10, one of the things that I've kind of done is I've broken up into this who, what, when, where, why categorization, right? And really what I wanted to pay attention to this week is this idea of scientific mission design. Of course, as teachers, right, or even as students here, right, you can choose to kind of engage in this process as you'd like. But one of the things I want to start with is this idea of who, right? So how you decide to break up this idea of mission design is that it can occur at multiple different levels, right? So you can have each individual person think about what it is that they want to do utilizing the sensors available. Those individuals then can group up into partners, right, or pairs, and they can kind of work through this idea of what they were individually thinking and see if there's any ideas that a partner might be able to provide that they weren't able to do by themselves. And then lastly, in this context of a small group, right, about 3-4 people, one of the things that students should be able to do here is consider how can they maybe take multiple data points, right, or multiple ideas and be able to merge some of them down together potentially, right? So within their payload, how can they make this payload that they're sending more useful to send rather than just trying to accomplish one thing, right? But potentially by accomplishing more than one, even consider this idea that multiple data points combined gives us more information than any one of those data points individually might have been able to provide. And then lastly, kind of this large group idea where you can have the smaller groups now come together and be able to critique each other, right? So understanding that it's not the individual, right, or persons that are being critiqued in that portion, right? But instead, the context of how it is that the idealization of what a scientific mission that contributes all of these different data points simultaneously can be looked at with a critical eye, right? So I think in this who portion, it's important to kind of separate the person, right, the individuals from the actual missions themselves. So as students, one of the things that you can do is kind of be clear that you want that critique, right? The more and more, right, and the more rigorous we are with actually being critical in terms of what we present as being feasible, right, or missions that we want to kind of undergo, right? Getting more and more clarity and getting that more and more refinement in those things, right, are all good things. The second point here is the what, right? The student development or implementation of specifically explanations that actually need data to determine whether or not they can be disproven, right? This is really the whole point of why it is that we are undergoing this process, right? A lot of times, I think it's difficult for us to contextualize why we build CubeSats or why we build these payloads, especially for those of us that get kind of caught up in the nitty gritty, right, or that daily grind of troubleshooting. It's easy to lose sight of kind of this big picture. But really, the whole point here is to determine whether or not some of the things that we are thinking about, some of the explanations and or hypotheses that we develop can actually be shown to be true, right, by disproving other explanations, or we can disprove an explanation that we actually want to test. This third point is the when, right? So when is it that we actually undergo the scientific mission design process? And as I've kind of stated earlier, this idea that after students have a familiarity, right, and a understanding of what the limitations of their sensors are and of their hardware is, and not just limited to hardware, but also software, they can then go through and talk about why it is that they want to collect the data that they actually do and what the value of collecting that data is, right? So the when portion here is really important. It's hard to have this discussion of scientific mission design if you're not really sure what it is that you're working with. So once we understand what it is that we have, then we can start to decide whether or not what we have has those limitations, right, or are going to impact our ability to actually undergo and facilitate whatever projects it is that you are personally, right, as an individual or as a school interested in. One of the nice things about scientific mission design, right, whether it's individual, partner, small group, or large group, is that it can be done both virtually as well as in person, right? So you can find ways to kind of, collaborate across different groups, collaborate across different schools as well. But in person, there's definitely greater benefits to the process of scientific mission design, right? Being able to have that kind of fluid conversation, utilize physical tools such as whiteboards, right? And when you're in person, there's just a different level of understanding, specifically each other, right, between people, right, versus having that process done virtually. But you can do this in both ways. So I think it's really important to recognize that scientific mission design, right, doesn't have any barriers in terms of communication in that sense, right? You can do it in all of these different ways. And you can do it at different points in time too, right? You can have a mission design right? Once you identify a particular sensor, right, and have missions developed around each particular sensor, right, and then come back together and say, okay, so now that we've defined and we've gone through this process of looking at all of these different sensors, how do they all come together? And then lastly here is the why behind what it is that we're doing, right? And I kind of got into this a little bit earlier, and I would make the argument that some engineers would push back on me when I make this statement. But for me personally, right, as a science teacher, specifically a physics teacher first, the whole point of engineering design really stems from the need to collect data in the first place, right? So the engineering aspect is what allows us to collect that data, right? The science portion is what determines the need for that data to be collected. So engineers would make the argument that, engineering design advancements, right, or engineering advancements in general are made by specifically driving the scientific need to explore, right? So you can make the argument both ways of chicken or the egg, right? Which one comes first? But for me, in my biased opinion, right, really the science prompts that engineering. And if you go ahead and take a look at our actual outline, right, from the C3PO, you'll see that idealization is consistent all the way through from our communication weeks all the way down to this week in operations. So starting with this idea of the scientific task, right, and how that then implements into the engineering task with your particular payloads in your schools, right, or within your groups, right, we can kind of see how one builds into the next. So one of the things that I just wanted to share as well is some of the prior research projects that my students in particular have done. So for teachers, right, one of the things that you can do here is have students think about not just what sensor data is being collected, but how it is that that sensor data might be able to affect kind of these bigger picture ideas, right, outside of the context of what they're directly doing. So it's easy for us to look at the light sensor, right, and think about, oh, how does light affect living systems? So here's an example of how we looked at specifically UV and UVB rays, or UVA and UVB rays, in the context of biomedical engineering. So when students are able to consider what their interests are, right, and what actually drives their curiosity to determine, right, some of these things, you get really, really interesting research projects. So here for that biomedical engineering, right, this is a student that was interested in specifically flying planes, right? So a high school student at the age of 18, right, who was taking flying lessons at a local airport, right, found that as he got higher and higher into the air, right, the actual effect that UVA and UVB rays had increased. So one of the things that the student wanted to see is what the effect on the retina in particular was. You'll see here that there are secondary research options as well, right? And the reason why those were identified as well is specifically because we wanted more than one reason for that sensor to fly, right? So again, going back to this accountability and responsibility aspect, right? When we think about having that accountability, right? When there are multiple projects that the sensor relies on, or that sensor data is then going to give understanding to, right? There's a higher buy-in in making sure that that sensor works properly. Right. So the last two that we have here in prior research projects is one for magnetic fields, right? Being able to kind of correlate a relationship specifically of B field, right? And finding planets that are habitable, knowing that our magnetosphere is one of the primary reasons why life still exists on Earth. And then lastly, in the materials engineering, right, again, taking a look at UV and UVB rays in the context of specifically this idea of what's happening at different altitude bands, right? And thinking about what the materials are for not just spacecraft, but small satellite craft, right, as it's in space, right? So thinking about space ready materials, right, and what the effect of UVA and UVB rays in particular are on those space ready materials. The next slide kind of goes through some of our current research projects that we'll be undergoing at Montgomery High School in particular in the context of our payload that is going to be launched on the bluShift rocket. So there's three in particular that we're looking at, right? And these are three different kind of fields in which that application exists. one of the things that I believe I've shared earlier, for those guys who have joined us for prior sessions, is this idea of being able to use sound as a secondary measurement for the dynamic pressure levels as they're changing within the thermosphere. In the context of aerospace engineering, kind of a classic type of experiment that you can run. One of the things that's special, again, just to reiterate, is on the bluShift launch in particular, we'll be able to have power to our payloads during the entirety of the flight. So being able to have a vibration sensor and accelerometer to determine a vibration profile for the bluShift rocket within its maiden flight, I think is a really exciting opportunity for students to kind of be a part of this idea of citizen science, right? And having that data set and being able to compare it back to the data set that bluShift will be collecting for their own flight profile on their maiden flight as well. So again, as stated from the prior slide, right, there's the secondary research options that are listed out as well. And then lastly is this idea of the materials engineering, right? And in this context, one of our student groups came up with this idea that, electromagnets can be made up of different kinds of, wires that wrap around the actual magnet itself, and different magnets as well. And their actual field strength vary depending on the materials. One of the things that they were interested in seeing is how it is that these devices might potentially be able to act as a shield for both high energy radiation as well as cosmic rays. So these are just a couple of examples of research projects that are currently being developed, and the integration of these things directly in the payload for the bluShift launch is kind of what that next step is for us. And again, we explored it a little bit in the payload sessions, right? Now the actual implementation of that, right, is coming down to more of the engineering aspects. The last slide that I have here is just a couple of extension activities that you could potentially do with your students as well. So one of the things that I have here is engaging in a Harkness table. If you are not familiar with what a Harkness table is, it's this idea that students come prepared on a topic. So in the context of what we were looking at here, it could be come prepared in the context of a sensor, right, with thinking about what possible scientific missions could be carried out utilizing that data that would come back from that sensor, or a Socratic dialogue based on each one of the sensors or any combination of the sensors, right, being identified within a particular scientific mission, right? So having that discussion in the context of Socratic dialogue, right, why it is that it's valuable for that data to be collected in the first place, right? And why it is that that data might be helpful to collect and what value it has for us coming back at the individual, partner, small group, or large group level. The second one that I have here is this idea that you can flip the script, right? Instead of having, as I've been kind of outlining this idea of a scientific mission design, right? Instead, you can think of it in terms of an engineering payload design, right? And the way that you would do that is instead of thinking about what are the sensors that we have available, think of it as what's a scientific mission that we, or what's a scientific hypothesis or explanation that we know of, right? That we can define new criteria to, utilizing different sensors to be able to do that, right? So one of the examples that I gave was this idea of using sound as a secondary measurement of pressure, right? So rather than thinking about what the scientific mission is, right? The scientific mission in this case is already predefined, right? What are the different ways that you can design an engineering payload to specifically make measurements of that sound to then correlate that to a change in pressure in particular. And then lastly is this idea that I've kind of touched briefly upon about this idea of being able to kind of create different metrics, right? Not looking at a particular data point, but how that one particular data point and another one, or the combination of X number of, which is right, which can be defined by the students, right, at again, the individual, small group or large group level, right, and how those data points, when they come together, might be able to give a bigger picture, right, or be more valuable than any one of those data points themselves. So really here, one of the kind of crucial parts to recognize is we're not necessarily stating that the metric is something that already exists, right? This metric can be student defined, right? Students can make the decision for how they want to determine, right, what something being efficient or something being effective is. So for example, a metric that exists in our everyday lives, right, is something like UV index, right? It's not just telling us specifically about UVA and UVB data, but it's telling us the integration of, how is it that lux or light levels play into the role of how we determine whether or not UV is going to be harmful, right? Or UV is not going to be harmful that day, right? So it takes into consideration other environmental conditions such as humidity, temperature, as well as cloudiness, right? So how much of that visible light is actually coming through, how much of it is being reflected. So this idea of a UV index would be a metric that utilizes, again, these multiple data points and shows it as a singular value, and can tell this bigger picture. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys today in terms of my presentation. One of the things that I'll do is, if you're interested, is make sure that we have the presentation available. And if you reach out to Judy directly, Judy Sandrock, she'll be able to get those things over to you. If you are looking for the actual teacher notes for this bulk week of week 10 to 13 for operation, or 10 to 12 for operations, feel free to shoot, again, Judy Sandrock an email, and she'll be able to get that information out to you guys. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of move through with the engineering task as well. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out on the Discord server, and I will see you guys there. All right. Thanks again for joining me today, as I kind of went through the operations portions in the science task. And hopefully we'll see you guys next week for the engineering task as well. All right. Thanks so much.